I first wrote about Jason Kenney's fight back strategy when he unveiled it at a late 2018 conference in Calgary. And then, of course, he became premier in April of 2019. And we've seen the Alberta Energy War Room created, and we've seen the public inquiry into foreign funded activists, and many, many spats with the federal government, the ones that many observers said were unnecessary and overly bellicose. And then, of course, the carbon tax challenge was ruled or quashed, I guess, by the Supreme Court of Canada yesterday, the latest in a long string of defeats for the fight back strategy. So we're going to talk to political scientist Duane Bratt about that. Welcome to the interview, Duane.
Hey, good to see you, Markham.
Look, what are we supposed to make of this? So what do you make of it as a political scientist, this, pugilistic, bellicose fight back strategy? And it just seems to be, one mess after another.
You referenced that conference in October of 2018. I was actually at that conference in Calgary because it was a large conference. It didn't just include Jason Kenney, but Darren Billis, who was an NDP minister at the time, Scott Moe, the Premier of Saskatchewan, was there. Andrew Scheer, the then leader of the Conservative Party, also spoke. But the keynote was Jason Kenney. And the ovations he was getting when he went through the fight back strategy was remarkable. And I spoke to a fairly senior energy executive at the break, and I said, do you think this is going to work? He goes, well, we want someone fighting for us. And I said, yes, but do you think it's going to work? And he goes, no, but we need someone to stand up and fight for us. And so I think we need to separate the political strategy from a policy strategy. From a politics point of view, the fight back worked in the sense that he won the 2019 election, won it quite handily. But from a policy perspective, almost everything that they've done has been a loss. So I went back to an article I wrote just after that conference where I cycled through all of the fight back platform, and I'm going, they created the war room, and they did. It's been an embarrassing fiasco, and it gets worse by the day. They did create the Allen inquiry to investigate environmental groups. It's also been an embarrassing fiasco. They did repeal the not least carbon tax. The federal backstop kicked in, and then they, as you mentioned in the intro, they have now lost that court case. You could add to that, campaigning against Justin Trudeau in the fall 2019 election. Jason Kenney even went to Ontario and Manitoba to campaign against him. Trudeau gets reelected. The KXL bet, has now lost $1.5 billion. Threatening Trudeau to apply economic sanctions against the US. That didn't happen, and you're not hearing much about that anymore. So I don't know where the policy win is outside of the election victory. There's still a few more things to come. We're still going to have this referendum on equalization. But even if he wins that referendum, what is that going to do? And he needs a really high number, like a really high number to say yes, to basically, what he says, gain leverage to deal with that. So there's still that possibility. But he's actually taken this fight back strategy and broadened it, where he is fighting everybody, and not necessarily on behalf of the oil sector. So he is fighting municipalities in Alberta. He is fighting post-secondaries in Alberta. The tone of the Premier's office and the issues managers and the press secretaries is very combative. So it's like this fight back strategy isn't just about oil and gas. It is ingrained in this government that they will constantly fight. Not everything's an election campaign. At a certain point, you have to pivot to govern.
And it appears that that hasn't been a priority. And we have now 2 years of evidence of the outcomes of the fight back strategy, and he's not gained a single solitary thing that he promised on the campaign trail in 2019: jobs, pipelines, investment, all of that. None of that has happened. And now let's take another look at this. It seems to me, I was a student of Canadian history way back when I was in university, and it was all in the Canadian Federation is set up so that you have to have alliances and you have to cut deals and compromise with other provinces and the federal government. And it's very much to make it work, you have to work the politics. Am I correct in that, Duane?
Yeah, and so I've got a major study that's coming out next week. I've been working on it for several months. It just happens to be coming out next week through the University of Ottawa's Positive Energy Program, looking at energy environment federalism. And I sort of did a teaser op-ed tying it into the carbon tax yesterday. Um, but you're exactly right. This is a big, messy country, and you've got to work with either different provinces or work with the federal government. Now, Kenny did have a series of allied provinces in this fight. You know, he had Saskatchewan, he had Ontario, Quebec intervened on behalf of those three, even though they were not affected by the backstop. And but you're watching the disintegration within a day of that coalition, of that, as Maclean's called it, the resistance, because Scott Moe has said they're going to come up with a made in Saskatchewan plan. Ontario seem to have lost the spirit of fighting Ottawa as the pandemic kicked in, and they just seem to go, yeah, we lost, we'll move on, we'll continue with our plan. Aaron O'Toole came out and said, you know, we're still going to scrap the federal carbon tax, but with no support from the conservative premiers. No one echoed him, no one joined him, no one thanked him. And then you have Jason Kenney, and I watched his press conference yesterday, and I still am not quite sure where he is going to go. Is he going to just say, we're going to let the backstop remain and remind Albertans every time that they're paying Trudeau's carbon tax? Or will he bring it back into a made in Alberta plan? The problem he's got with making it a made in Alberta plan, and it's a problem Scott Moe does not have, is he repealed a made in Alberta plan. Not only that, in their election platform of 2019, and I think this is a key point that hasn't been recognized enough, they promised not just to repeal it, but to apply the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act to any addition of a carbon tax requiring a referendum. Now, I looked at the bill that was passed repealing the carbon tax. I looked to see if they actually amended the language of the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act. They haven't done so, but it was a clear promise that they would require a referendum. And that was consistent with about 3 years of rhetoric from various conservative politicians in Alberta saying it was a referendum question. It is a sales tax. It's a tax on everything. That may be boxing Kenny in, which is why in his press conference, he was basically saying, oh, we're going to consult with Albertans and we're going to consult with allied provinces because we don't really know where we're going to go next.
Let's pull back a little bit, Duane, and put this in an international context. We just had the Joe Biden elected president. We have a Biden administration that's very intent on regaining the lead in the clean energy, clean tech arms race from China and from Europe. It made it very clear, I think, over the last 2 months that he expects Canada to be an important part of their supply chain development and so on. And then you have the federal government here in Canada that has, major update to its climate plan in mid-December. I mean, all of the international trends, the economic trends, the technology trends, the policy trends are going in exactly the opposite direction that Jason Kenney seems to go. And that seems, for my take on it, has a lot to do with why he keeps losing all of these battles.
Oh, I think so. It's not, if your enemies list just keeps growing and becomes broader, maybe you're actually on the wrong side of this. But there's been a lot of speculation that a handful of us have had about what Kenny's frame of reference is. And really, we're coming down to it's 1994, it's 1995, that his impression of Alberta and of the oil and gas sector is really out of date. Even though he was an elected MP from 97 onward, he didn't spend a whole lot of time in Alberta. He was either a federal cabinet minister or he was campaigning for the Conservatives in other parts of the country. And so there's a question about whether his knowledge base of Alberta is out of date, because there's been some other missteps outside of the energy sector that has really hurt him, which tells us that perhaps his pulse on the province isn't quite what it is. Uh, but there's other elements that show a much more sophisticated Jason Kenney. So you put the carbon tax to one side and you look at the rest of Notley's climate leadership plan, everything is still in place. And in many cases, it's been strengthened. The coal phase out is moving faster. He did bring in the tier program, which was much stronger than any other program that had existed in the province, but it's not something he actually talks about a lot. And so there's almost like these two Jason Kenneys, sort of the private Kenney who is supporting initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then the public bellicose, let's fight everybody. And does he really believe that? I think part of it he does, because he is a political fighter. Or does he think that that sells to his political base? But when he's around the table with senior engineers and business leaders, I expect that we're going to hear a lot more from David Knight-Legg, for example, who's leading Invest Alberta, who is now the chair of their ESG program, has a much more sophisticated understanding of the investment community around oil and gas than, for example, Tom Olson in the War Room does.
Well, let's talk about the environment, both the political environment and the policy environment. Now, I'm hearing from people in the industry that investors are actually walking away from Alberta citing political instability. And that is, that's a trickle now, but if it gets to be any more, that's going to be a huge political problem for Kenney. And I'm also being told, when I interview experts in other countries about how those countries or states, for instance, are dealing with the energy transition, that policy and regulatory regimes are absolutely critical to moving forward into this, low carbon future. And it seems like Kenney's getting a lot of that wrong. So,
yeah,
the chickens are coming home to roost here very quickly for Kenney, other than just the politics.
I'd like to see if we could actually properly quantify the cost of this fight over the federal carbon tax. Because I tweeted out yesterday that it was millions, possibly billions of dollars that were lost in a fight where we're pretty much could be going back to the same position we were 2 years ago. And people go, no, the legal bill was only $1 million. Why would you say billions? Well, when you look just at the carbon tax, it was going into provincial revenue. And even when you remove the rebate, it was over $1 billion a year. You times that by 2 years, that's $2 billion. What has been the investment chill as a result of this fight? That's a much tougher number to quantify, but it could very well be in the billions of dollars. That it's not just that this fight back strategy hasn't worked, it possibly made things even a lot more worse for the government. And you can imagine the interconnection with the Biden administration, and not just Joe Biden, but the people around Joe Biden. How much damage did Jason Kenney cause to Keystone himself? Again, that's tough to quantify without doing a deep dive in a series of interviews. But if the Biden administration is thinking it's Trudeau, but you've got this premier over here doing something else, that creates uncertainty.
Duane, thank you very much for these insights. Really appreciate it.
Okay, you're welcome.